All right, welcome. This is Chapter 8, which is Ethical, Social, and Political Issues in E-Commerce. There's also a supplemental video that I linked from the syllabus. It's in UJA and it's in YouTube. Okay? Supplemental video is on privacy and internet or cyberspace law. Okay? So make sure that you take a look at that supplemental video, which goes over some very important concepts and laws that are relevant to this course, but also relevant to those of you who are going to work in a business in the future. So in that other video, I talk about different privacy laws. I'll talk about some of them here as well, but make sure you watch both videos. Okay, so in the US, we don't have this general concept ingrained in us of privacy. We have, the right to not be subjected to unreasonable searches and seizures, but historically, we really haven't had any laws in this country that are focused on protecting our privacy as a whole. So, what we do online, there really isn't any protection of that. Companies can go and use that information however they see fit. Okay. We do have some very narrowly focused privacy laws for the governments. Okay. The Privacy Act of 1974 governs the federal government's behavior. We have FERPA, which governs education, your student records, that sort of thing. But beyond that, we historically haven't had anything in the U.S. Okay? And if we have had something, it's been relatively weak and done at the state level. So we don't have this fundamental idea that we have a right to privacy. We don't have a right to privacy codified in our laws. Okay? Now, contrast that to, say, Europe. And in Europe, you have a fundamental right to privacy. It's baked into the concepts and the laws of the European Union. So if you live in the European Union, those laws give you enormous protections. A few years ago, 2018, I believe it was May, the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, was signed into law in Europe and took effect. And that effectively provided immense protections for people who are residents of Europe. And this also protects businesses as well that are based in Europe. So the concept of data in Europe is you own your data. You decide what can be done with it. You have certain rights, like the right to be forgotten. We don't have those same rights here in the U.S. Generally speaking, I'll tell you a caveat to that at a weaker level in a second. But what we also have to remember is just because it's a European law does not mean it only applies to European entities like a European company. It actually can apply to US-based companies, even if you don't have employees in Europe or you don't have customers in Europe. Okay? So if your website does not restrict the ability of people in Europe to, say, use your website, you could potentially be liable if someone from Europe goes in and you collect their data without properly asking for permission. So one of the fundamental pieces of that legislation is that you have to get permission. You have to get an opt-in from the user, an explicit opt-in. It's not enough to tell them that they have to opt out. That's not acceptable. And that's how we generally do things in the US is anybody can go subscribe you to a list and then you can opt out. So you actually have to opt in, and when you opt in, you only are opting in for the purposes that are disclosed at the time that you opt in. So, right now Facebook is wanting to collect information for personalization purposes, and you opt into that, they can't turn around and sell your data without you being prompted of, we're changing from just personalization, now we're going to monetize your data. If they don't explicitly ask for your permission again, they don't have your permission. Okay, you have to explicitly grant it. Now, there are other ways to grant permission. You can have a contractual obligation and other things. That's outside the scope of this class. I think I get into a little bit of that in the video. Now, at the beginning of the chapter, there is a case about Google, okay, and this idea of the right to be forgotten. And what happened in that particular case was Google has certain search results, and the information that was returned was information that the person did not authorize. Okay? And so there's a requirement that Google removes links in Europe. Okay? So it's a requirement. Now, go through that case. It's a very interesting case, and I think it's informative for most of you. Okay? Now, let's talk about some of the issues just in general for this particular chapter. So, e-commerce is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And one of the things I talk about in the other video is around cyberspace law. And the fact that cyberspace law involves activities that are not within a specific jurisdiction necessarily means it can be ambiguous, because whose laws apply when you're conducting an activity that isn't physically sitting in one place. Okay, it's one thing if my neighbor trespasses into my yard. Okay, well, that's happening in Riverside County, for example. Okay, and so Riverside County laws apply. Well, Riverside County is part of California, so California laws apply. California is part of the United States. Maybe U.S. law applies, but because it's involving land, and land is not something that is generally part of federal law, it's not crossing state lines and whatnot, that's generally going to be stuck within the California legal system. Okay. Global reach. So not only can we reach within a country, within a state, within a county, within a city, but when we're doing things on the internet, including e-commerce, we could be transacting with people around the world. So international laws can come into play, like the GDPR that I mentioned. Incidentally, same thing with Canada. Canada has their own privacy laws. Okay. Universal standards. So on the technology side, we generally have internet standards, okay, which can be a great thing from an interoperability standpoint, a bad thing from a vulnerability standpoint, okay, because now an attack can affect everybody and every piece of technology potentially. Okay. Richness. So we have the ability now to do video, audio, text, even further than that, interactivity, okay. Wasn't always the case. Information density. Technology reduces the cost of information and presumably raises the quality. Okay. That being said, we can also have false and misleading information, which we may be seeing here in the last few days. So that becomes an issue. Actually, one other thing before I talk about the issue is this also can lead to unwanted invasion, so potentially security breaches and things like that, which leads to things like potential trust issues, authenticity, accuracy, completeness, and the quality of information can be degraded. And we do see that on a day-to-day basis. We see lots of different actors in the world might share fraudulent information, including videos and photos these days can be doctored too. So we don't talk about it in this class much, but if you ever get a chance to do some of the colloquiums on the campus when it reopens, The CS, computer science, and computer engineering departments usually have artificial intelligence researchers come out and talk. And one of the interesting things that the campus has research going on right now, and for one of my former TAs was in this particular area of research, is being able to generate fake videos and photographs. And their logic behind it is they're trying to build out MRI images, for example, of cancer. And there isn't enough data of real MRIs. So they use AI to generate fake MRIs of cancer that they can then train the machine to learn how to spot cancer. So it helps with the research for diagnosing cancer, but they're using AI to actually generate those sorts of things. Okay. Customization and personalization. So we can have invasion of privacy on levels that has never been contemplated previously. And then social technology. So we can have now not only the opportunities that social media offers, but also we can have things like cyberbullying occurring, abuse, predators, etc. Okay, and this can be part of our e-commerce system. We have to be cognizant of it and mindful and take adequate precautions. And so within an internet-based society like we are in modern times now, we have multiple dimensions. Things like information rights, property rights, public safety and the welfare of others, and governance. And those surround things like political issues, social issues, ethical issues. Looking at ethical at the individual level, social issues at the society level, and then political issues from a policy perspective. Okay. And then internet e-commerce is at the center of all of that. Okay. Let's see here. So ethics, just as a review for those of you who don't recall your philosophy classes, ethics being the study of principles that individuals and organizations can use to determine what's right and wrong. Okay. We have responsibilities in a society, so we have responsibility for our own individual actions. Accountability, we should be held accountable when we take actions. And then liability is where we have laws in place to permit remediation or remediating actions against things that we've done that have wronged someone else. Okay. All right. We face a lot of ethical dilemmas in this industry. When we're doing our e-commerce site, how much privacy do we afford? Do we go beyond what the law requires? Do we do just enough of what the law requires? And then hopefully not that we skirt the law and just hope we don't get away with it. Okay. Privacy and information rights. So again, we've got this privacy law in the EU that I talk about in that other video. I also talk about the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, which is a new, coming up on 1-year-old law about privacy, although not nearly as good as the one in Europe. Okay. And then I talked about the right to be forgotten. Okay. All right, so one area we do have in the U.S. is the Federal Trade Commission. And so the FTC does have something called the Fair Information Practice Principles. Okay? So you may have received these privacy notices in the mail for, your credit card, or, if you have a house, your mortgage, and maybe from your rental agency, maybe even your doctor's office. And so there's the idea of providing notice. So what are your information practices? Choice or consent? Access and participation. So you should be able to review and contest the accuracy of any data that's collected about you. Security. So the people or businesses collecting data. need to be able to take reasonable steps to ensure that your information is accurate and secure. And there has to be an enforcement mechanism. Okay. Now, in the private sector, there are a variety of laws applicable to actors in the privacy or in the private sector. Excuse me. First of all, there is you've got the FTC. You've got state laws. You can have not really laws, but voluntary or involuntary industry regulations. You can have specialized regulations like HIPAA for healthcare data. Okay? Now, the U.S. government has a series of laws that apply to it for different things. So I already mentioned the Privacy Act of 1974. This is all about how much information and what type of information the government can collect. Okay? There's the Freedom of Information Act. So this gives you the right to inspect what's in the government's records. Okay? You've got the Privacy Protection Act. So this prevents unannounced searches of press offices if there's no suspicion of a crime. Okay? And in particular, I'll mention this one. This is one of the reasons why the government can't just go into one of the media outlets that perhaps the whoever the current administration is at any one time can't just go in and seize materials just because they don't agree with them. Right? We are a representative government, and we have certain restrictions as to what can happen there. Electronic Commerce Privacy Act. So we want to make sure that no conduct that's illegal can occur with electronic communications. So, for example, wiretaps. You have to have a court order for a wiretap. And that also can extend to other electronic systems as well. The Computer Security Act. So you can't infringe on the security of a computer system. You can actually go to prison for that sort of thing. Hacking fits into this area. Computer Matching and Privacy Act. This is matching of files held by government agencies, so there's regulation there. We've got the driver's privacy protections. So state motor vehicles have to limit access to their data that they have on individuals. The E-Government Act regulates personal information collection by federal agencies. And then the USA Freedom Act limits the bulk collection of our metadata. Okay? That was brought about because of the Patriot Act. And actually, I don't have it anymore. I used to have, actually, hold on, maybe I do still have it. I guess not. I used to have a national security law book that was very good, but I don't have it anymore apparently. Okay, so then we've got privacy laws that affect private institutions. So we have the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FERPA Act, which has to do with your educational records. Okay? Right to Financial Privacy, Cable Communications Act, Video Privacy Protection Act, COPA. COPA protects children. And it's why your kids, if you have kids, can't sign up for accounts online without parental permission, and also not when they're below a certain age. The Telephone Consumer Protection Act, HIPAA I mentioned already, and then the Gramm-Leach-Billy Act. That has to do with financial institutions. Then there are some state privacy laws. The CCPA, I already mentioned. There can be online privacy policies, digital device privacy, spyware legislation, disclosure of security breaches, and data encryption. Okay. And so the type of information that can be collected by e-commerce sites is pretty substantial. So, you might think, okay, my name, my email address, etc. But if you go on to page 517 of the 2019 edition, you will see there is a lot more data that could be potentially collected. And I also showed earlier in the course logs and whatnot from systems that can collect data. Okay. All right. Personally identifiable information is any data that can be used to identify, locate, or contact an individual. Okay. And then anonymous information is demographic or behavioral that doesn't include any personal identifiers. Okay. And there's a whole list of different internet collection tools for privacy related data on 518 of the book. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and location tracking. So location tracking is something that is relatively recent, related to our mobile devices, mostly. But being able to geolocate where someone is when they post something, okay? Or where our phone just happens to be. There, we're not generally using. Actually, we're not using this at all in our elections in the U.S., but in other countries they do. This is a relevant topic, so I'll mention it. So I used to work for an e-voting company. We had software that allowed you to vote from your smartphone, tablet, computer, whatever. It's not used in the U.S., so don't worry. It's only used overseas for big elections. There were some pilots of using it in local elections, but never been used in a presidential election. The closest we've come is military and overseas ballots can be processed through the system, submitted, and then a paper audit printed off, and that's how those are counted. But that company went out of business, so that doesn't even exist anymore. But I bring that up because there was a push at one point to have geofencing of voting, so you could even take your device potentially into a polling place and use it to vote, or this was more likely the case, you could use an iPad or an Android tablet to cast a vote. But if you try to take that device outside of where it was geofenced to by location, it wouldn't actually allow you to cast a vote. So someone couldn't walk away with it and just start having people vote on it. The geofencing technology was actually specific to a room within a building, even. Mobile devices, we have potential privacy issues, especially around location. We have the FTC, and we have this idea of having informed consent for approval of our personal information. We have opt-in and we have opt-out models. Okay, opt-in being in order to even collect your data, I have to have you opt in. Opt-out is by default I'm going to collect your data, and then you have to opt out if you don't want us to use it. Okay. You should have a privacy policy on your website. The good news is most websites just copy each other's privacy policy and have a lawyer tweak it. Okay. But if you are going to do things the right way, you probably want to have a lawyer drafted specifically for your site. GDPR, this was designed to harmonize the privacy laws across Europe, and it's done a fairly good job. You can pretty much ignore the section on Privacy Shield and Safe Harbor agreements because that was recently ruled illegal. And so Privacy Shield and Safe Harbor are gone. Okay, so don't exist anymore. That's a recent event this year, in the last few months. Cross-site tracking, this is how we track people across the web. So say I'm shopping on Amazon and I'm looking at a new spatula, and then I go to CNN and it's showing a picture of a spatula on Target. Okay? That's from cross-site tracking. All right. Let's see here. There are various privacy advocacy groups to be aware of. The one that we tend to think of is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, okay, or EFF. But there are multiple advocacy groups out there for privacy. There are limitations on the right to privacy, so law enforcement can conduct surveillance, excuse me. And so the Patriot Act is one such example. Some aspects of the Patriot Act have expired, but not all that I'm aware of. And then intellectual property rights. We have different types of intellectual property protection. So we have copyright law, which protects original forms of expression, like, you know, if I write material for this class. Video, so this lecture is copyrighted by me. If you go and share it with someone else, you've violated copyright law and I can come after you. Okay. If you reproduce a textbook, you violated copyright law and the publisher could come after you, and they have deeper pockets than I do. Music, if you copy some sort of music file, you could end up getting sued and end up paying a lot of money. Okay. Fair use. Fair use is not a defense in most cases. Okay. There are very narrow exceptions under fair use. It's litigated, it's well established, and just because you think that you have a reasonable fair use for something doesn't mean that you do. In fact, even professors and teachers, it's highly restrictive on us as well. Okay. So, for example, I can't go and just copy the book for you simply because I want to save you money, okay? Or because you can't get the book. I can't do anything about that. The most I can do is maybe post one chapter on iLearn until people can get their textbook. Okay? I can't reproduce a bunch of graphics out of the book, etc., or other materials. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, that basically was our first real attempt at changing copyright law to be modernized for the modern era. This is what makes it illegal for you to go and take a DVD and copy it. DVDs have copy protection. If you copy a DVD, you violated that copyright protection under the DMCA. And not only will you probably have the original author of that movie or whatever you have copied showing up on your doorstep wanting money, you might end up with the FBI knocking because you've committed a crime. Okay, so there's actually criminal penalties as well. So, DMCA, that's on DVDs, ebooks, software, etc. Other countries have their own copyright protection. We also have international treaties that govern copyrights and other intellectual property worldwide. Okay. Patents grant a 20-year monopoly on the idea behind an invention. And so you get exclusive right to a particular invention, okay, for a period of 20 years. Okay. Oh, also about the patents, you get an exclusive right for 20 years, which also gives the ability to license that patent to others, so you can monetize it. Okay? So say I patent something, I don't want to build it myself, someone else wants to build it and sell it, I can license it to them. So patents are licensed very frequently. Okay? But in exchange for getting that exclusive right for 20 years, you have to actually disclose the details of your invention publicly. Okay? So if I go to my patent here. Oops. Okay. Now I can show you this. Okay. So this is a patent filing. It's a patent application, and it's pending. So if this gets issued, then the assignee, or if you don't have an assignee, it's the inventor. Okay? But in this case, the rights to the invention have been assigned to this corporation. Okay? It's filed, and you can see it was filed several years ago, okay? 3 years ago now. It gets a priority date. The priority date is the date that then applies for worldwide patentability. Okay? And I'm going to show you an example of this in a second, what I mean. Okay? So the patent date, priority date was 2017, August 18th. Okay? It was published 2 years, almost 2 years later, I guess 18 months later. Okay? So for that 18 months, no one knew it existed but myself, my co-inventor, and the assignee. Okay? Now it's published for everyone in the world to see. Okay? And given that election day was yesterday and we're still waiting, it might be of interest to you because it actually relates to voting. Okay? But it's been cited here. If I scroll down, though, it's going to be better to just scroll down all the way to the bottom. They're very long, lots of details in them. You have to explain every little bit so that a person who's skilled in the art can actually do it. But it's been cited by this patent, which has a later priority date. Okay? And so it was cited by a completely different patent. Okay? And this actually happens to be it's a U.S. patent here, but if you click on it, it's actually a Chinese, sorry, not Chinese, a Taiwan company. But then if you go down here, you can see where this is at. So it's still pending and it's waiting for examination by a patent examiner. Okay? Every patent has to be examined. If they decide that it's a novel idea and meets all the other requirements for a patent, it will go from an application to an actual patent. And then there's a 20-year period that the entity that's assigned the patent can license that technology. So if someone decides to go and do another attempt at e-voting down the road and they want to use this same solution, okay, or something close to it, they would have to license this from the assignee. Okay? And again, that's assuming that the assignee doesn't want to go and own it themselves. All right, so let me move on. All right, so there are some interesting cases in here about patents, which would be interesting. Amazon had a patent on one-click purchasing. It's expired now for 3 years. But for 20 years, nobody else could have a one-click purchase process on the internet. Okay? There's a lot of other really interesting patents in here that you can take a look. Okay? So there's some, I think a lot of these are very interesting around, searches and advertising and things like that. So I think they'd be very interesting to you. Trademarks. So things like logos, brands. Okay? If you're a marketing person, you know what I'm talking about. Okay? Trademark helps to protect those items. Okay? And so domain names fall within trademarks usually. Okay? And there are now laws in the books for cyber squatting, meaning, I can't go and buy the domain name that's someone else's intellectual property, their trademark or whatever. Because back when the web first took off, a lot of big businesses didn't take it seriously, so they didn't own their own domain names. I'm trying to think of some examples, but big companies, I think maybe even Apple, I don't remember if Apple was one of them or not, but a lot of them did not own their own domain names. Okay. All right. Trade secrets, we don't really cover that very much in here, but trade secret is things like the Coca-Cola formula or the 11 herbs and spices in the KFC recipe, okay, for their chicken. That would be the trade secrets. As opposed to a patent where we publish the information, a trade secret we do not. We try to hold off, keep that as secretive as possible. We use non-disclosure agreements and things like that. Okay? Governance, that is who controls. So the internet as a whole is controlled by a nonprofit organization or government entities or commercial organizations in multiple countries. So who controls the internet really depends on countries, but overall there are international bodies that regulate the internet and define the standards and things like that we use for the internet. In the US, we have ICANN or ICON and INA that do the regulation of the internet. Okay? In other countries, it might be more regulated than it is here. And that's why it's very concerning when we have anybody, doesn't matter who they are, at a political level, threatening to shut down the internet or threatening to shut down pieces of the internet. That's putting us in a pretty scary position where we're in the company of countries where they do lock down the internet. And so the whole, what are those apps? TikTok and WhatsApp and Snapchat and all these other, WeChat or whatever they're called. When there's threats of shutting down those applications, there may be, legitimate reasons for, securing those applications, but hopefully you can see there's a slippery slope when you start to shut down individual services on the internet. It becomes a slippery slope. What's to stop that from continuing to happen? Okay. All right. Sales taxes. So sales taxes are still an ongoing battle on the internet. Most states now levy a sales tax, but in the beginning, a lot of states did not. Okay? But the assumption was that if you bought things on the internet, it made it easier for businesses to start up if they didn't have to collect that sales tax for the government, but you were supposed to keep track of that and file it with your income taxes. Okay? And then public safety. So protecting children is very critical, and there's a law called COPA that you need to comply with as a business. So you should look into the COPA Act, but you also have things like CDA. And so CDA, the Communications Decency Act, affects things like pornography. Okay, so being aware of those types of regulations. These days, when I first started my first job out of high school and college, I worked for a startup in the early days of the internet doing commerce, and in those days there wasn't a whole lot of commerce. We're talking, pre-eBay days, but effectively the commerce was information, and the biggest form of information that people bought in those days was pornography. I would say that I work for this payment system, and probably 90% of our revenue was from pornography merchants. And the other 10% was a mix of everything else, including, incidentally, Cuban cigars at the time were pretty big to be sold and bought over the internet. I don't know how legal that is today, but back then that was pretty common. And then the remainder of it was, web hosting services and things like that. That was really what people used our payment service for. Gambling, drugs, cigarettes, these are all things that might be regulated by federal and state law. Marijuana as well, by the way, depending on the state. But at a federal level, it's still illegal. So take it as you will. that is it for this chapter. So make sure to watch the other video, and this material will absolutely be on the final exam. So you want to make sure that you study it. Okay?